I don't know about you, but I know that I have to constantly, every day, watch myself. I don't think I've ever had a day go by where I haven't judged something
Oh yeah,
or reacted
it's almost
against,
impossible.
whether it's a rock that, I run into and blame it, or a human being that I project my own unconscious shadows on.
Mm-hmm.
And so that process is what Ra is talking about. That's an extremely disciplined process.
One of the things that helped me a lot was when I took nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication training.
Mm.
And Marshall Rosenberg made the distinction between a judgment and an observation. He says a judgment always cuts you off from the other person. It creates separation,
Yeah.
which will lead to pain, whether it's conscious or unconscious, because it's an illusion, right? You can't separate yourself from anything in God. But, for example, if you say, that frat person is a real pig, that's a judgment. But if you say, I observe that person is having a really hard time maintaining their weight and that they must be frustrated, I would imagine they're frustrated or uncomfortable in that, that's an observation.
Yeah, it's still a judgment, but it has empathy with it.
Well, the thing is, though, is that, you see, when you look at what happens inside of you, if you're making a judgment.
Well, you made two assumptions there, and assumptions are judgments. So that person could easily disconfirm what you've said about them being overweight.
Yeah,
they may not struggle with it at all. They may love fucking eating donuts.
They might, but I mean,
I've met a few.
Yeah, they're out there. I'm trying to focus just on the concept of judgment versus observation, and the judgment. You think of judgment as a sword, because in tarot, judgment is represented by the sword. That's why you see tarot number 11, Justice, holding a sword in one hand and the scales in the other.
Okay.
She has to make judgments. She has to decide what to cut out in order to balance the community. That's the function of law, is to actually create balance and harmony.
Yeah.
But to observe, for example, in my work with the Empress archetype and the Emperor archetype, when I followed Ra's system and I met with the archetypes, one of the things that I learned from the Empress was, she said the Emperor alone cannot make effective judgment because he is too rational and discerning. So she gave me the example. She said, if someone reports to the Emperor that a man was caught stealing, and that's the only information he gets, if he's been caught before, he'll probably have him decapitated. But she says, I, as his Empress, carry the feminine wisdom that he lacks. And I, as the Empress, am more empathetic and compassionate to the vibe of the community.
Yeah.
So she says, when I go to him and say, the reason the man's caught stealing is because his wife died and he's got 2 little boys and he can't go to work, therefore his kids, without him getting food, are going to starve to death. So he doesn't want to steal. It's not that he's a bad man. He does not know how that he can take care of 2 children all day without somehow getting food.
Yeah.
And therefore, do you really want to kill this man when he's doing his very best to fill the role of mother and father at the same time? And he's not really stealing. He's borrowing food from the community so that he can do the service of raising 2 contributors to the community.
Right.
And the Emperor says, well, now that I understand it from that perspective, no, we don't want to kill him. We should probably help him.
Right.
Okay,
right.
So the point is, the Emperor has to make a judgment, but without the Empress making an observation, he can't really make an effective judgment.
Yeah.
So that's a simple way for me to create an analogy of the difference between a judgment and observation. The Emperor sees the judgment. He's stealing, punish him. She says, wait a minute, you have to know the context. Here's what I have observed by being part of the community. This is what I know to be true from being in the community.
Yeah.
And so the other context is that if we make an observation, that tree has a beetle infection, that's an observation. But if we say, that's a damn ugly tree, look at all those beetles, cut it down, that's a judgment. So one's making a distinction to remove, the other one's simply saying, look at all the beetles in this tree. but it's not necessarily saying I'm going to cut it down or I'm going to do anything about it. It's like I see your height and your weight, but I don't make a distinction. Is he strong or is he weak or is he old or is he young or is he too old? Those are judgment words, right? So I think my only point is, for me, it helped me when I find myself judging, it helped me say, okay, now here's my opportunity to see if I can do an observation without needing to rank or cut out or segregate.
Yeah.
And that helped me a lot. It made me feel a lot, I felt more love in myself. I found when I was judging without observation that I was cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting.
Yeah.
And somehow it makes the ego feel better about itself, but it doesn't actually make the soul feel good.
Right.
But I found if I observe, and also when I switch to, instead of look at that fat person over there, what a pig, I say that part of myself must be really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because I know if I was that big, I would be really uncomfortable.
Right.
So
now you're also building empathy and understanding.
yeah. So when I try to switch from judgment to observation and hold the understanding, which I've had profound experiences of, that I'm just looking at another expression of myself, then it helps me shift into this more heart-centered orientation, which I think has helped me quite a lot. I mean, Bill Gates and Fauci and crew.
How do you love them?
They've been really a great exercise for me, because there's times when they really scare me. Like I'm like, okay, these guys are out of control.
Yeah.
And the warrior in me jumps up. And it puts me into quite a like a really Hall of Mirrors type experience, where I'm like, okay, how do you deal with this?
Yeah.
How do I deal with this much darkness? And how do I remember that the function of evil is to uphold the good, and that you can't have light without dark? And so I have to start carefully analyzing, and that takes a fair bit of work that most people don't want to do.
Yeah, and even the word evil is pretty interesting, because I think it's more of that monotheistic piece of this kind of dark god piece. In more Buddhist traditions and in native traditions, it's more spoken of as ignorance. And I noticed that when I use the word evil, I personally feel more of a separating myself from that than a sense of ignorance, because I can relate to me being ignorant a heck of a lot easier than me being evil. And it makes me wonder, I don't know exactly the etymology or when the word evil came into our lexicon, but
it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah. Whereas the sense of ignorance, I immediately have a sense of, okay, so if these individuals are acting out of ignorance of Creator, then how is it that I'm ignorant? And I can find so many ways, and then I'm immediately in resonance, at least with the fact that these are human beings walking alongside me on the planet in where we have ignorance. And I can use their awakening, my own shadow, to ask myself, why am I being triggered by this situation? Because Ra's picture is, before you're unswayed, the response to every moment is love. And if there's a different response coming out of me than love, then that bears investigation.
Which leads to the problem that when you're caught in the industrialized world and you're constantly trying to make money, and you're rushing from day to day to appointment and etc.
Yeah.
And when you do get a minute, you just want to do whatever works for you. Drink some wine, some alcohol, smoke some pot,
TV, whatever it is,
television,
go to sleep.
I certainly reward myself at the end of the day with a chance to stop working, because I work a lot and I think a lot and I create a lot. And so for me, it's like, okay, I give myself permission to disconnect from having to have an output. Right? But my point is that we've collectively created an environment in which we are chasing an outcome so often that we rarely have the time that it takes to do the kind of inner spiritual work that you're talking about, which is looking at our shadow, looking at what we're projecting, look at what we're judging, where are we judging versus observing. And that I've been working on like building that into my life so that when I'm triggered, I say, okay, now let me look at that if I can. Sometimes it's as Zig Ziglar would say, I'm ready, fire, aim.
Right.
And then I have to do it at night as I'm going to bed. When I go to bed, I do I do what you talked about with Steiner. I go backward through my day and say, okay, or not necessarily backward. I look at all the events of my day, and I say, where could I have done better? And that, to me, is an important practice. That's part of the function of the soul. That's the reflection aspect of the soul. Mm-hmm. And without that, then you tend to repeat painful behaviors over and over and over again and create more and more trauma in your life. So you just end up being, multiple layers of PTSD as metaphor.
Well, just a little spark note on that. Steiner has this picture that when you do the Rukshao, certainly using the reflective practice to see what was done and what could be improved, and then immediately shifting to, and this means I set my resolve that tomorrow I will, or the next time I see this individual, I will.
Yeah, that's what I do.
Yeah, good. Yeah, it's that way.
To me, that's the whole point of it.
Well, his suggestion is that not to do that can start to lead to a kind of depression, because then you're just reflecting backwards and going, look at me, I screwed up here, I screwed up here, I screwed up here. And if you don't set the intention or the resolve, then you just sort of start to fester rather than having a way through.
You've just described one of the most common problems with people that use psychedelics too much.
Okay.
Because the plant medicines show you all this stuff where you're not living and loving honestly, openly, and to your potential, which most people call a bad trip, by the way.
Yeah.
And then for me as a therapist, when I'm working with people in this space, I have to work with them in an integration process, which could be a meeting for a day, which could be several appointments stretched out over the series of weeks, depending on what the context of the ceremony was, why it was done, how it was done, the intensity, the duration. But the point I'm making is if you keep diving into your unconscious and going into your personal unconscious and your shadow and your family trauma and all that stuff, but you don't set a plan to orchestrate who am I going to apologize to?
Yeah.